They came for him. They criminalized him. They subdued him. They suffocated him. His lungs were giving out. His arms began to weaken. His eyes started to close. His voice was giving out. The community heard him cry. The community watched him die. No one did anything. No one could. He died. He died slowly. He died publicly. His name was Jesus.
That was Dr. Biko Mandalay Gray sharing some of his latest writings, a way for him to make his point that anti-Blackness is a form of atonement. It was a powerful way to start our time together with Project Curate, a collaborative effort between the nonprofit and the Louisiana Conference. In this episode of Louisiana Now, we share some of the highlights of that final webinar. Welcome in, everyone. I'm your host, Todd Rossnagel. It is great to have you along with us. This is a shortened version of that final module, 90 minutes in length. The entire module is well worth your time. You will be challenged, you will be pushed into some uncomfortable corners, but that's precisely the point. We've included the links to all three modules as they were recorded, and they can be found on our YouTube channel. We'll have the links in the show notes of this episode. Now, the last module with our time together with Project Curate was focused on anti-Blackness, which is different from racism in general. Panelists for this module included the aforementioned Dr. Biko Mandalay Gray, a professor of religion at Syracuse and a community advocate. Also joining us was Brandi Holmes, who felt summoned to leave a successful corporate career 6 years ago and now focuses her work on various Black liberation struggles, and Reverend Dr. Cleve Tinsley, co-managing director of Project Curate. Dr. Tinsley is a scholar of religion and Black studies. Now, all of our time together has been a great start to the deeper conversations of racial injustice in our country, and we do plan on having more conversations, so be on the lookout for that in the days and weeks ahead. But we need to do more. In fact, it was one of the first points that Dr. Tinsley would make. Robust partnerships are great, but we are not doing a good job of gathering together and building community.
We've not done a good job of doing what we call community building and organizing. Yes, we do a good job of building insider groups, right? But what we don't do is a good job of building even amidst communities that we claim to be in solidarity with. Most of our appeal to them is to come to us on our terms. And so their interests and needs become secondary to our proselytizing interest on a respect. But then we haven't done a good job of community organizing on top of that. Now, community organizing requires a different kind of skill set. It requires the ability to translate our ritual practices, the symbols we use, the narratives, and to engage in what we might call a critical exchange with folks who are different, folks that we have othered, folks who we might say are our neighbors, but typically that seems to be a pejorative term among white progressives at first. When you say neighbor, you're meaning those other folks who are not like me, but I'm going to deign myself to go service them in some way. I may move into their community, right? But when I think of neighbor, I'm not thinking of somebody who is like me, I'm in solidarity with. No, this is just my act of service. And so there's those three things that I argue in this piece. One, we should use the power of convening. We need to do a better job of learning how to build community with others and also organizing. And a key aspect of organizing, I argued, was engage in a critical exchange. And what does that mean for you? I'd like for you for a moment to try to suspend the kind of stakes we have in the ground, right? The theological orientations and things we would willing to go to die for, and say, what does it mean for me to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't speak in the same type of rhetoric I speak in, right? What does it mean for me to observe that I am a community of language, but everybody doesn't know what it means, quote unquote, to be saved, or quote unquote, to kind of come to the cross, or come to go to say Jesus is my savior.
As we said, our focus in this particular module was anti-Blackness. And Dr. Gray challenged all of us to see anti-Blackness as a form of atonement. The challenge was deeply personal and deeply theological.
Anti-Blackness in the United States is a form of atonement. I will say that again. Anti-Blackness in the United States is a form of atonement. That means that someone is saved because Black people die. I will say that one more time. Someone is saved because Black people die. Much of Orthodox Christian theology is structured around the doctrine of atonement. In other words, Adam and Eve did some things that God didn't necessarily approve of, and so there was a debt that was owed. And so Jesus comes to essentially pay that debt, to be the one to essentially be the person whose death pays the debt that is owed by humanity. In other words, the death that humans owe to God in order to be righteous gets displaced onto Jesus so that people can live. That's atonement theory in its most basic form. What we see within the context of the United States is a mutated version of this atonement theory, particularly as it relates to white people and Black people. And this is actually the structure, in my mind, of the West since modernity. So let's think about this. What does salvation actually mean? It comes from the word salve, which means to heal, which is a kind of balm, which essentially, when we think about salvation from its sort of Greek terminology, it's actually talking about being comfortable, being healed, feeling better. When white Puritans came to this country or came to this land, they did two things to make themselves feel better. One was to actually completely destroy indigenous communities through genocidal actions. The other move, and this is what I mean by anti-Blackness being a structure of atonement, the other move was to displace the burden of clearing land and building a nation, displace that debt, displace that equity, that energy onto an entire community of people such that white people could feel better. That's what I mean by atonement. That the burden, the debt gets displaced onto Black people such that white people can feel better. This doesn't end in 1863 when Abraham Lincoln reluctantly and by protest signs a piece of paper. This doesn't end in 1863 because Reconstruction is a very short period of time, and then all of a sudden we're back at it again. Why? Because the northern states make a compromise with the southern states, and all of a sudden we see the eruption of vagrancy laws, of sharecropping, all of these things. What are these particular laws actually doing? They're actually displacing again the burden of developing the land for white comfort and white safety. We saw it happen again when we think about these questions of lynching, so on and so forth. Speed it up to 2014 to 2020. Let's just jump 100 years. We know what happens in the intervening years. One of the things that you notice in the acute situation of these particular killings is that who ends up actually paying for, or who ends up actually taking the responsibility of the evil when people are killed by cops? It is not the police who end up paying the price for doing the dirty work that they do. Mike Brown was understood as an angry demon. That is the displacement of sin onto Mike Brown's body to make Darren Wilson look good.
The challenge to look at the institutional nature of our systems in America continued. Brandi Holmes challenged us to look closer at how we lift up certain narratives. Holmes spent some time in Louisiana. In fact, she worked in the state during her corporate life and was fascinated by the idea that plantations were tourist sites. She decided to visit some of them, Laura Plantation and Vacherie being one of them. Her visit reminded her, and she reminded us, of the power of story.
And what was interesting to me is that Laura's plantation told a very interesting story about slavery. It told a very interesting story about the institution. Laura, in many ways, was glorified as a wonderfully ambitious, industrious woman who saw an opportunity to really excel her business and her life for those that she profited from. And the stories and the language that they were using was really interesting. The language they used we're talking about and referencing the slaves, right? And I think it's important for us to even pause here to think about the language that we use when we talk about slavery, right? The condition that folks found themselves were that they were enslaved, right? But when we use the terminology slave, that then allows us to place an identity mark on these individuals, which then further allows us to dehumanize, right? Which then makes it palpable that slavery was an institution that existed in this country, right? When we begin to glorify Laura's story and tell the story of how kind she was to those that she owned, but they were her friends that she cared for. She gave them wonderful clothes. She made sure they had heating in their cabins, right? When you begin to glorify the story of slavery, let's think about what that does to us as a general people when we begin to tell these stories. So I encourage us to think about the language that we use. I encourage us to think about the historical sites and symbols and markers. I encourage us to be a bit disturbed when we notice that a friend or family member chooses to have a wedding at a plantation. What does that really mean? Who's crying out from the grounds of those locations? What voices are being told? What stories can we hear from those moments?
Holmes continued to challenge us with narratives that we repeat, the media repeats, culture itself repeats.
We also watch in the media how those who are simply protesting and present with a sign are being met with extreme amounts of violence, militarization that has now been introduced. But we also see individuals who have AK-47s and are extremely hostile in the face of police, which seem to be able to return safely to their homes with no sort of hostility or resistance met with their presence. Let's ask ourselves these questions. Why is this happening? Who is this happening to? And what does this mean for us as a people? I even think about this idea of unity, right? The festival and celebration that oftentimes happen. I love Louisiana, I love Mardi Gras, I love everything that goes on along these things. But I feel like it creates this sense of unity because there's this proximity to Blackness and proximity to culture. And yet the allure of this fantasy that creates a kinship, when in reality, we don't really ask the question, what happens to the folks who return to the lower ninth after they come from Mardi Gras? What happens after February? What happens after March? Who are these folks that are deeply affected by the really very real realities of what's happening in these moments? So I encourage us all to begin to really interrogate not only what we think, but also about how we act. In many ways right now, what you were seeing is that folks believe that the pro-Black movement or the movement for Black lives is really an anti-white movement. And that's merely because the pro-Black movement, pro-white movements have always been anti-Black. Yet in this moment, we're seeing the folks basically demanding a call to justice and accountability. Oftentimes what's met in this moment, folks are very confused or concerned, and what we see is silence is the response.
We're going to take a quick break and hear from our sponsor, the United Methodist Foundation. When we come back, we're going to take a closer look at one of the overarching themes from not only this webinar, but the others as well. The United Methodist Foundation is excited to announce a series of webinars aimed at helping all of us during these unique times. All month long in August, you'll learn from some of the best. 4 webinars aimed at giving and financial affairs. Concerned about your annual campaign in the midst of COVID? Don't be. Carl Madison, Director of Plan Giving Navigator, will discuss tactics for developing a theme and messaging, How can we encourage generosity in these times? And how can people give when their lives and finances have been turned upside down? We'll explore these topics and more all month long. They'll also assist all of us as we assist our aging parents, the right questions to ask, how to take care of living trusts, power of attorney, and more. All of the webinars are free. The dates and times and registration links can be found on their website, umf.org. Back now to our episode, our friends from Project Curate, wrapping up our modules with a lesson on anti-Blackness. And one of the questions we got a lot, not only in the third and final module, but all of them for that matter, is this: what's next? What can we do? Where do we go from here? The practical question of what to do. Our panelists spent some time addressing this. Dr. Tinsley said his experience has been that many churches are afraid to do the work.
Experience has been that religious leaderships and institutions have often been scared of having the conversations. Why? Because we're forced to then grow in a certain way. We're not comfortable going in territories we're not comfortable with as leaders. If somebody's pressing us to do different language, then in many ways we view that our authority is being challenged, right? And it's the reason why a lot of academics, a lot of activists, a lot of organizers can't converse with one another because they're scared of the conversations. And by they, I mean us. Those of us who are in the church have been scared to even convene the conversations outside of what we're comfortable with. And so I would say our first thought is engaging in different strategies by bringing convenings. The second step is what we're doing at a small church I'm at in Galveston, is we're doing different kind of partnership and ministry arms to do that. We're contracting with other justice workers and organizations to create different models of meeting the needs of those most vulnerable on their terms. What does that look like? Going to them, one, being community building and being a presence, but also not engaging in an exchange with them. They have nothing to give us, right? And so what does that do when your bottom line is not about counting butts in seat and thinking about how much I can give back to a conference? Then what does that mean for our ministry strategy? What we found is that kind of work is hard. I'm able to do it only because I've been able to carve out other liberties, right, that enable me to do it. It doesn't require a whole bunch of money and support from the institutional structure to do so. That's a different way of doing it. It's a cutting against the grain, but it's also a way that's not oftentimes supported by our leadership. And that's sad, because the truth of the matter is we have to ask the question, what would Jesus actually be doing in modern times if Jesus were alive? Would Jesus be concerned about sustaining the institutions, concerned about asking questions and figure out who's going to have the largest church that's going to split off on what so we can have the most budgets going on? These are all superficial matters that we as clerics get involved in. Is what actually pushed me to engage in more critical spaces, so that if I was able to come back, gratefully I was, that I'd be able to have more honest conversations about this without my pension being threatened, without me being called in to a special meeting with my bishop because he didn't appreciate how I said something.
Dr. Tinsley went on to say, the way we think determines how we act. But if our thinking is cloistered and narrowed, not challenged, then we are going to act to maintain our own interests.
It's not so much that you got to have all the answers, but maybe these things will help us formulate better questions, right? Because if I have better questions to ask, then I'm able to engage in robust conversations, which lead me into more collaborative solidarity relationships with others. It's the reason why we in Project Curate are specialized in collaborative responses. Why? Because it's only in collaboration that my weaknesses become really heightened and the strengths of others become salient as well. And then I'm forced to do something. I'm either forced to run away and get out this thing, or I'm forced to kind of grow and live into this and mature in a way that allows me to function in a more accountable kind of relationship. And what we run the danger of is the reason why philosopher Royer used to say all religion is a conversation stopper. Because when we throw out the symbol God, oftentimes what we're saying is, listen, I can't talk to you because, listen, I'm saying God called me, right? And what can you argue with if you say God has ordained this? That's been the move since history. It's the whole reason behind the myth of Ham and the whole reason why these narratives are used to do that.
Holmes answered the question of what's next with a question of her own.
What would you do next if an Amazon package came and you were trying to figure out how to assemble your new bicycle? Or what would you do next if you're trying to understand how to make a flambe? You would hop on Google and you would say, hey, I want to make a flambe. And you look at all the different videos that are available. You all do this in your daily lives now, right? Like, you want to know how to do a thing. You go on Google and you look toward the resources that are available to find the voices that can give you the solution necessary to solve whatever problem you're facing. So in this instance, don't freeze up, right? Recognize that you're going to get it wrong. I appreciate Rihanna's tattoo that says never a failure, always a lesson. And you continue to move forward into this thing. And so what do I do next? Well, we guided you along this path of, hey, what is the community asking of our particular congregation? What are voices now who don't look like me, don't sound like me, don't come from the space I say? What are they asking for?
Dr. Gray reminded us all of the words of Cornel West. You fail, and you fail better.
First, we have to stop thinking and stop looking at anti-Blackness as a problem to be solved, but an actual existential structure that needs to be addressed. And what I mean by that is that anti-Blackness is a world-forming structure, which means that this world has to change for anti-Blackness to go away. And so what that ultimately means is that all of our efforts here are always going to be piecemeal and partial, but that doesn't mean that we don't do anything. I think Brandi's absolutely right. I'm not a huge fan of Booker T. Washington, but cast down your buckets where you are and go do what you need to do in terms of whatever resources that you may have. Fail and fail better. You will fail. You will be called out. Things will go poorly, but that doesn't mean that you quit. That's what often happens, is that this white ego is so fragile that the first time someone says you messed up, it's like, well, I won't try again. And I think the truth of the matter is that in the same way that we think of sanctification, I know we're not Calvinists here, but I know that the same way that we think about sanctification, there's a process of getting better. We have to think of this work of pushing against anti-Blackness as a process of fighting, of changing the world, literally shifting the structure of existence in order for justice and equity to show itself.
We learned a lot during this webinar, and all of them for that matter, 5+ hours. I would encourage all of you to head to our YouTube channel and find the videos of each webinar. We've included the links in the show notes of this episode. As we say goodbye, a reminder from Brandi Holmes to the work of racial reconciliation and the challenges of doing the work.
The appropriate response in this moment is not silence, but for us to begin to do the work of justice. What does that mean? Well, that means being here in this space is a very good first start. It is a very good first start, but you also must continue to do the work of interrogation. You also must continue to do the work of thinking about, how can I go out to learn from those who are willing to share, who are willing to teach me? And when I go out into these spaces, recognizing that the teaching that is done by these individuals, these Black bodies, is labor for those individuals, and that is an extreme gift to be the recipient of those things. And I would encourage you to continue to follow the leadership of those in the community, because those who are most affected are the ones who have the solutions to all of the ills that we continue to see that society faces now. So if you're confused about which groups those are, if you ever see the words disproportionately affected, if you ever see the words marginalized, if you ever see the words striking data that points toward, it's going to be Black folks, just like we're seeing in COVID-19. And it really implores us all to begin to continue to think about, what work do I need to do now in this moment?